It began with a silence that seemed to have weight. The kind of silence that presses itself upon the skin, not merely an absence of sound but a tangible presence of its own. On the morning of May 2, 1895, the peasants of a small hamlet in northern Transylvania awoke to a dawn that felt wrong. For generations, when they stepped from their timber houses and crossed the dew-heavy grass, their eyes would wander almost automatically to the ridgeline above the valley, where the monastery of St. Ionar stood. Its stone walls rose grey and immovable against the morning sky, a bastion of continuity in a land plagued by change. But on this morning, the ridgeline was empty. Where towers had loomed the night before, there was only a pale wash of fog and a sloping field that looked too clean, too untouched, as if no hand of man had ever set stone there. The first to notice was a shepherd returning from an overnight watch. He swore later that in the small hours, he had seen the monastery lights burning faintly through the mist, as they always did. But when the sun rose and he glanced back toward the hill, expecting the comforting silhouette of the bell tower, he froze. The shape was gone. He rubbed his eyes, even shielded them against the pale morning light, but no trick of the mist could conjure the missing walls. As he drew nearer, disbelief curdled into dread. Where there should have been foundations, rubble, or at the very least broken timber, there was only a wide stretch of flattened grass, as though a giant hand had swept the earth clean. He ran to the village shouting words no one understood until they saw for themselves. The villagers gathered at the site in a hesitant procession. Women clutching children, old men leaning on sticks, young farmhands who whispered nervously as they climbed the slope. They reached the crest expecting ruin, a collapse, perhaps, or some calamity that had brought the old stone edifice to dust. But they found no dust. The field bore no crater, no scattered brick, not even the fragments of glass that once adorned the monastery's narrow windows. A few patches of wild grass bent as though recently pressed down, but beyond that, the land was bare. One boy bent to the ground and brushed his fingers along the soil. It was smooth, untouched by shovel or hoof. He pulled his hand back as if the earth itself had recoiled. For centuries, that monastery had been more than a landmark. Its bell tower was the first thing villagers saw at dawn and the last they glimpsed at twilight, a fixed point against the uncertainty of their lives. Its bells had marked births, deaths, and marriages, had called them to prayer and told through storms that threatened to swallow the valley. Its sudden absence was not simply the loss of stone, it was the dislocation of their entire world. Some fell to their knees, crossing themselves feverishly, whispering prayers in voices so shaky they resembled sobs. Others shouted in anger, demanding explanations that no one could give. The parish priest tried to rally them, to suggest perhaps some hidden truth, a removal they had been kept ignorant of, but his words faltered when he too looked out upon the empty rise. As news spread beyond the immediate hamlet, neighboring villages sent their own to see. By noon, a small crowd gathered around the vacant field, their expressions mirroring the disbelief of the morning witnesses. Some walked the land in wide circles, pressing their heels against the earth to feel for hollows, searching for hidden entrances or buried chambers. Others muttered that it was the work of Satan, that the monks had been taken body and soul into the earth for some sin committed in secret. Still others whispered that it was divine intervention, that the monastery had been a place of hypocrisy and false worship, and that God himself had swept it away as punishment. Yet there were no signs of divine fire or infernal claw. There was simply absence. A void where presence had been. And it was this absence that terrified the villagers most, because it left no narrative, no evidence around which to construct meaning. One woman wailed that her brother, a lay worker at the monastery, had been there the night before. He had not returned home, and now she feared he was gone along with the stones. Others nodded grimly, recounting that monks had been seen moving about the grounds the previous evening. Yet not a single man of God remained. Their chambers were empty, their belongings vanished, their bodies nowhere to be found. The silence of that morning grew into a thing unnatural. The meadow seemed hushed, as though the land itself refused to acknowledge the enormity of what had occurred. Birds did not sing over the site. Even the wind seemed to pass over it differently, carrying with it a thinness that unsettled the lungs. Villagers said that to stand upon that field was to feel as though one had stepped into a dream, not the vivid kind, but the kind where everything is muted, hollow, and subtly wrong. More than one visitor swore they felt the faint ringing of a bell in their ears, though no tower remained to strike it. By evening, disbelief had curdled into collective fear. They returned to their homes, locking doors, barring shutters, whispering stories to their children in hopes of soothing them. But the children asked impossible questions: where did the monks go? Would their houses vanish next? If the monastery could dissolve in a single night, what else might disappear come morning? The days that followed saw a strange kind of paralysis settle upon the village. No one knew what to do with the field. Some wanted to consecrate it again, to plant a cross and mark it holy. Others demanded it be left untouched, for fear of angering whatever forces had taken the building. Rumors spread quickly, carried by traders and wandering laborers: a monastery gone without trace, a tower evaporated into fog. Some dismissed it as peasant exaggeration. Others shuddered, remembering their own tales of cursed ground and places where churches should never have been raised. Within a week, pilgrims began arriving, desperate to see for themselves. Some came in awe, believing the sight blessed, a holy wonder revealed by God's own hand. They knelt and prayed on the grass, hoping miracles might follow. Others came out of morbid curiosity, pacing the field with measuring rods and compasses, seeking patterns in the earth. None found answers. The more they searched, the more the mystery thickened. For not a single stone could be uncovered, not a single scrap of wood or iron nail remained. It was as though the monastery had been carefully erased, plucked from time and space, leaving no shadow behind. The villagers, once comforted by the tolling bell, now found themselves haunted by its absence. At night, some swore they heard the echo of the tower bell carried faintly on the wind, a hollow sound that seemed to come from nowhere. Others dreamed of monks wandering in silence, faces veiled, moving through fog only to vanish when approached. Slowly, the community began to avoid the hill altogether. The field became a place of dread, its emptiness heavier than any ruin could have been. And so the first chapter of the mystery was written not in words or relics but in silence, in the stark and chilling realization that stone and faith alike had vanished overnight without leaving so much as a trace. The silent bell tower had fallen not with thunder, nor with fire, nor with violence. It had simply ceased to be, and in that absence lay the first and deepest wound of all. To understand the monastery's disappearance, one must first step into the world that surrounded it, a landscape as ancient as it was enigmatic. Transylvania in the late 19th century was not merely a geographical region but a tapestry woven of mountains, forests, and villages where the weight of history clung as heavily as the mist in the valleys. The monastery of St. Ionar had not been built in isolation, it was part of a land already scarred by centuries of conquest, rebellion, and superstition. By 1895, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled over Transylvania, but beneath the thin veneer of modernity, the people still lived in a rhythm unchanged from the medieval centuries. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, the soil, and the lingering shadows of an older, more fearful world. Imagine the setting: dense forests of fir and oak that whispered in the wind, their branches seeming to close around travelers like the ribs of a cathedral. Carpathian peaks loomed in the distance, their jagged outlines often blurred by mist, making them appear as if they were shifting specters rather than fixed mountains. The villages were small and scattered, clusters of timber houses with steep roofs, smoke curling from chimneys, and crucifixes hung above doorways to guard against unseen evils. Roads were nothing more than muddy tracks, often impassable in the rains, which meant that every settlement felt isolated, adrift in its own orbit of belief and rumor. The monastery itself stood on an ancient rise, a hill that locals said had always been avoided by shepherds before the monks arrived. It was not that the land was barren or inhospitable, it was fertile enough, with grass thick enough to feed flocks. But for reasons whispered from parent to child, villagers had been reluctant to dwell too close. Some said the hill was once the site of a pagan sanctuary, older than Rome itself, where rites of blood had been performed under the full moon. Others claimed it was a burial mound, an ancient necropolis filled with bones that did not belong to Christian men. The monks of the 15th century, fleeing Ottoman incursions, had chosen it precisely for its isolation. To them, a hill avoided by peasants was a gift, land to be claimed, stone to be laid, faith to be planted firmly where it had not grown before. But from the beginning, their choice was uneasy. Records kept in brittle manuscripts, some still held in diocesan archives, describe how the first abbot, Brother Anselm, wrote of an atmosphere heavy upon the spirit at St. Ionar. He spoke of nights when the wind seemed to carry voices, of soil that resisted the spade, and of a restlessness among the novices. Yet the work went on, and soon the grey stone walls rose into the air, crowned by the narrow tower whose bell would one day be known across the valley. The peasants came to accept it, though always with an undercurrent of unease. They attended its services, but they avoided lingering after dark. When they passed the hill on long journeys, they often crossed themselves or muttered a prayer under their breath. By the 19th century, the monastery was no longer new but ancient. Its presence was woven into the geography of the region, so much so that maps marked it with precision, pilgrims sought it for confession, and travelers used it as a waymarker. But its age did not erase the strangeness that clung to it. Pilgrims often remarked that time seemed slower there, that days felt heavy and elongated within its cloisters. Villagers told of how animals refused to graze too close to the walls, skirting the grounds as if driven away by some unseen scent. Local folklore claimed that the bells tolled differently on certain nights, not merely marking the hour but echoing with a mournful resonance that did not belong to iron and bronze. Transylvania itself was a land steeped in such contrasts. While towns like Cluj and Sibiu bustled with merchants and scholars, the countryside remained rooted in superstition. Tales of Strigoi, the restless dead, still circulated widely, and every family knew rituals to keep evil from crossing their thresholds. Faith was both devout and fearful. Churches and monasteries were seen as bulwarks against chaos, but they were also places where the boundary between the sacred and the uncanny thinned. The peasants prayed earnestly at St. Ionar, but none doubted that its stones were laid upon a land where older gods had once been worshipped, and older dead still lay uneasy. Accounts from travelers add another layer to this atmosphere. A German cartographer who passed through in 1834 described the monastery as a fortress of faith set in a valley of ghosts. He noted how locals lowered their voices when discussing it and how even the monks seemed somber, their chants less like praises and more like laments. An English physician, traveling in 1861, remarked upon the pallor of the monks, attributing it to poor diet but hinting at something peculiar in their countenances, as if they bore a weight unseen. Such outside descriptions reinforced the aura of the place, an institution respected, yes, but never truly at ease within its own walls. The land around the monastery also carried scars of war. Ottoman raiders had once swept through the valley, leaving behind burned farmsteads and graves. In the 17th century, when plague ravaged the region, villagers dug mass pits within sight of the tower, hurriedly burying their dead. By the 1800s, those pits were covered by grass, but their memory lingered. Some whispered that the monks had dared to build atop ground too soaked in death to ever be cleansed. If the monastery had survived for centuries, it had done so against the grain of the land itself, as if it were tolerated but not truly welcomed by the earth upon which it stood. Yet for all its unsettling aura, the monastery remained central to life in the region. Its library held texts copied from older centuries, its scriptorium preserved records, and its monks provided aid to the villagers during famine and sickness. Pilgrims came not only from Transylvania but from across the empire, some seeking healing, others merely curious about its reputation. The bell tower became a symbol of endurance, the ringing heard even across valleys serving as both comfort and reminder. It was a paradox, a place feared and revered, avoided and sought after. This tension between sacred and sinister defined the atmosphere of St. Ionar and the land it inhabited. The villagers lived in a world where the natural and the supernatural overlapped, where the soil itself seemed to breathe with stories too old to be told outright. When the monastery vanished in 1895, it was not simply a building lost. It was the tearing away of a landmark deeply entangled with the land's memory and myth. The hill that had once borne walls now bore only silence, but that silence was amplified by the centuries of shadow that had always surrounded it. In this way, the setting itself becomes part of the mystery. The monastery's disappearance cannot be separated from Transylvania's landscape, its haunted forests, its history of conquest, its folklore of restless dead, and the uneasy coexistence of Christian faith with something older and darker. The land and its shadows framed the monastery, and when those stones were gone, what remained was not a neutral field but a stage upon which centuries of fear and reverence had already been performed. The monastery did not vanish from emptiness. It vanished from a place where silence had always spoken, and where absence could be as powerful as presence. Long before the dawn of 1895, before the villagers awoke to find the hill stripped bare of its monastery, there had been whispers. Whispers of unease, of peculiar incidents that clung to Saint Ionar like ivy winding around stone. Though the monastery stood firm for centuries, its walls seemed to breathe with disturbances that no priest's sermon could fully dispel. The earliest records describe a sanctified home of prayer, yet beneath the rhythm of monastic chants lay a note of dissonance, a trembling chord that the villagers felt more keenly than the monks themselves. It began with the bells. For generations, the bell tower was the heart of the monastery, its tolling carrying across valleys and fields, binding the community to its hours of prayer. But there were nights when the bells tolled at impossible times. Peasants spoke of waking to hear them strike at midnight or 3 in the morning, when no vigil was scheduled, when all monks were meant to be asleep. The sound was said to be faint at first, almost muffled, as if ringing from beneath the earth rather than the tower. Then, with unsettling suddenness, it would swell into a deep resonance that rattled shutters and stirred dogs into howling frenzies. The monks denied it, insisting their bells only rang when commanded by human hands. Yet too many villagers swore otherwise. Some even claimed the tolling continued after they had climbed the hill to see for themselves, only to find the tower still and silent, its ropes unmoved. There were other disturbances too, subtler but no less troubling. Travelers spending the night in the monastery reported hearing chanting long after Compline, drifting through the cloisters like an echo. They assumed at first that monks were engaged in private devotions, but when they inquired the next day, the brothers shook their heads. No such prayers had been offered. More disturbing were the descriptions of the chanting itself, low, rhythmic, and in a language unfamiliar. It was not Latin, nor Greek, nor even the rough dialect of the region. It was something else, something older, resonant with syllables that felt foreign to the human tongue. Those who heard it often remarked on the strange sensation it produced, a tightening in the chest, a rising sense of dread, as though the voices were not praising God but summoning something in the dark. Shadows also played tricks in the monastery. Pilgrims spoke of flickers moving along the cloister walls when no torches burned, dark shapes bending in places where no monk walked. On clear nights, some said the monastery itself seemed to shimmer when seen from a distance. From the far side of the valley, its walls looked hazy, as if vibrating in the air, their edges dissolving into the mist. Farmers claimed they sometimes saw the tower fade, not vanish completely but blur until it looked less like stone and more like a mirage. By morning, it would appear solid once again, yet the impression of unreality lingered, unsettling those who depended on it as a fixed and permanent presence. The monks themselves were not untouched by these signs. Though bound to vows of silence on such matters, a few records survive, scribbled notes in margins, confessions preserved in diaries never meant for public eyes. One novice wrote of dreams in which the cloister floor cracked open, revealing black staircases spiraling into the earth. Another described hearing footsteps in the dormitory when all his brothers were asleep. Some monks fell ill in ways that baffled physicians, wasting away with pale skin and sunken eyes, claiming they felt watched even when alone. Their decline was often attributed to fasting or disease, but whispers suggested the monastery itself was leeching life from those within its walls. Despite these anomalies, the monastery remained functional. Services continued, pilgrims arrived, and life around it persisted. But the villagers were never free of their unease. They noticed how shepherds avoided grazing their flocks on the lower slopes of the monastery hill. Horses balked when led too close, refusing to climb the final path. Dogs whined and pulled at their leashes, tails tucked, eyes fixed on the tower with naked dread. Even the earth seemed reluctant to yield. Crops planted on the monastery grounds rarely flourished, with vegetables sprouting pale and sickly compared to those grown in village gardens. The monks explained it as poor soil, but the peasants saw it as confirmation of a curse. The superstitions deepened with each generation. Children were warned not to wander near the monastery after sundown. Women whispered that if you stood at the gates at dusk, you could hear faint sobbing carried on the wind, as though the stones themselves wept. Some told of seeing hooded figures moving in procession outside the monastery walls, figures who vanished when approached, leaving no footprint on the ground. Whether these were the dead, spirits of monks long buried, or tricks of the mist, no one could say with certainty. But the impression they left was undeniable. St. Ionar was not simply a place of prayer. It was a place of presence, one that seemed to draw something unseen to itself. For centuries, these stories remained on the periphery, never fully silenced but never fully acknowledged. The Church discouraged such talk, urging the faithful to dismiss them as superstition. And yet the stories survived, carried in whispers, exchanged at hearths on stormy nights, embedded in the culture as surely as the tower was embedded in stone. The monastery was holy ground, yes, but holy in the way a storm is majestic, beautiful, powerful, and capable of destruction. Looking back, these disturbances feel like preludes, subtle harbingers of the catastrophe to come. The bells tolling without hands to ring them, the chants in forgotten tongues, the shimmering walls glimpsed by weary travelers, all of these were warnings, though few recognized them as such. To the villagers, they were unsettling but survivable, just part of living in a land where the veil between worlds was thin. To the monks, they were trials to be endured with faith. But when the monastery finally vanished, those earlier signs took on new meaning. They were not mere superstitions, not idle tales. They were the shadows of something vast and incomprehensible moving just out of sight, pressing against the fabric of stone and faith until, at last, it tore through. The first signs in the dark had always been there, etched into the life of the monastery like cracks in a foundation. The tragedy was not that no one noticed, but that no one understood until it was too late. If the monastery's earlier disturbances left the villagers uneasy, what followed its vanishing left them utterly bewildered. The most unsettling fact of that morning in 1895 was not only that a centuries-old structure had disappeared, but that no one, despite living within sight and sound of it, had seen or heard anything during the night. A stone tower, cloisters, chapels, and the lives within them had dissolved without noise, without collapse, without the slightest disturbance to break the stillness of the valley. The paradox became the foundation of the mystery: how could something so immense vanish without a single witness? The night before had been ordinary by all accounts. Villagers remembered watching the monastery lights flicker through the mist as the monks prepared for evening prayers. A shepherd guiding his flock recalled hearing the bell toll at dusk, its familiar sound echoing across the hills as it had countless times before. Families in their cottages retired to sleep beneath the same comforting silhouette they had known all their lives. No storms raged, no tremors shook the land, no unusual sounds troubled their rest. Yet when dawn came, the hill stood bare. In the days that followed, the villagers gave testimony that grew increasingly fragmented. A farmer insisted he had seen torches moving along the walls at midnight, though he admitted later it could have been foxfire glimmering in the wet grass. An elderly woman swore she heard faint singing in the early hours, voices she described as neither joyous nor mournful, but strangely hollow, echoing as though carried from a cavern. Others, however, were adamant: they had slept deeply, heard nothing at all, and awoke to a void that made them question whether their eyes deceived them. This absence of evidence became the most frightening element. Had the monastery been struck by fire, the blaze would have lit the valley. Had it collapsed, the crash would have rolled like thunder across the hills. Yet there was no smoke, no sound, no tremor beneath their feet. Even the animals, so sensitive to disturbances, remained strangely calm. Dogs did not bark, horses did not rear, cattle did not stir in their pens. It was as though the night had been held in a kind of suspension, time itself muffled, while the monastery simply slipped away. Some villagers attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps the monks had dismantled the structure in secret, working by torchlight while muffling the sound. But this theory unraveled immediately. How could centuries of stone be unbuilt in a single night without leaving so much as a pebble behind? Others wondered if the building had somehow sunk into the earth, swallowed by a pit or hidden cavern. Yet the field showed no collapse, no disturbed soil, not even the cracks one might expect if the ground had shifted. It was a disappearance without precedent, and it left the people staring at one another in dread. The testimonies recorded in the parish journal reveal the mixture of confusion and fear. One entry describes how a group of men climbed the hill at sunrise, convinced they would find rubble. Instead, they found only flattened grass, bent in strange patterns that suggested weight had pressed upon it. Another describes a woman who collapsed at the sight, sobbing that her brother had been serving in the monastery kitchen the night before and was now gone, as though erased. The priest himself, shaken to his core, wrote of his inability to explain what his eyes confirmed. He spoke of silence, so deep it seemed alive, a silence that lingered long after the crowd dispersed. The contradiction between what was known and what was witnessed created a tension that spread like infection. Villagers who swore they had heard nothing began to doubt themselves. Perhaps they had heard but forgotten. Perhaps they had dreamed through it. The human mind, faced with impossibility, bends toward any explanation, however frail. Yet each attempt to rationalize left them more unsettled. To admit the truth, that they had seen nothing, heard nothing, felt nothing, was to confront the idea that something beyond comprehension had passed through their world in the night. Stories spread quickly, some more dramatic than others. In one version, villagers claimed the monastery had been lifted into the sky, carried away by angels or demons. In another, it had shifted into another realm, visible one moment, gone the next, slipping through a veil unseen by human eyes. Such tales may have sounded wild, but they were easier to bear than the sheer blankness of reality. Nothingness was more terrifying than the most extravagant legend. In time, the silence of that night came to weigh upon the people more heavily than the loss itself. They had not merely lost a building, they had lost certainty. How could they trust their senses if something so massive could vanish without stirring them awake? How could they rely on the ground beneath their feet, the air they breathed, the hours they counted by the sun? Life in the village was built on rhythm and repetition, yet here was a rupture that could not be repaired. The villagers who saw nothing became both witnesses and victims of the void. Their testimonies, though sparse, carried the strange authority of absence. They had no evidence to give, no visions to recount, no sounds to describe, only the devastating truth that they had perceived nothing at all. And it was this void of perception, this blindness in the face of disappearance, that made the mystery so enduring. For what is more terrifying than silence so complete it swallows even the fall of stone? The villagers who saw nothing were not spared the weight of what had happened. They carried it in their memories, in their fearful glances at the bare hill, in the way they avoided speaking too loudly of the vanished monastery. They had seen nothing, but in that nothing lay the most haunting testimony of all. When word of the monastery's vanishing reached beyond the valley, it spread with astonishing speed. Within weeks, officials, church authorities, and curious minds from nearby towns arrived to see the sight for themselves. The locals had already begun whispering stories, of ghostly choirs, of divine punishment, of an unholy bargain fulfilled, but the men who came with notebooks, instruments, and stern expressions were determined to impose reason on what seemed like madness. They were the first investigators, tasked with answering the question that had left the villagers sleepless: how could stone, timber, relics, and living men disappear into nothingness overnight? The first to arrive were parish representatives, priests and monks from neighboring regions. Their purpose was not only to confirm what had happened but to preserve the church's authority in the face of a scandalous event. When they climbed the hill, they found no foundation stones, no shattered walls, no burnt beams, only a wide circle of pressed grass, strangely uniform, as though immense weight had rested there and then vanished. They prayed, sprinkling holy water across the hilltop, but beneath their rituals lay an unspoken dread. This was not the work of men dismantling a building in secret, nor of fire, nor of time. Something else had taken place, and they could not name it. Soon after, secular authorities joined the effort. County officials, accompanied by surveyors and constables, examined the ground carefully. They expected to find disturbed soil, sinkholes, or evidence of quarrying, but none of these appeared. One surveyor drove his staff deep into the earth, certain the structure had collapsed into a cavity, but he struck only dense, unbroken stone. The surface was curiously smooth and hard, without the unevenness typical of old construction sites. It was as though the land had never supported a monastery at all, though the villagers swore it had stood there for generations. Skeptical minds tried to frame the event within natural causes. One theory suggested a landslide had dragged the structure down into the valley during the night, but there were no rocks, no scar on the hillside, no displaced earth below. Another proposed a fire had consumed the monastery so completely that only ash remained, but there were no scorch marks, no soot, not even a blackened patch of ground. When pressed, the investigators admitted that even the most destructive fires leave residue, and here there was none. Church historians arrived next, bringing with them scrolls, parchments, and records of the monastery's existence. They verified its centuries of occupancy, its role in housing relics, and its long service as a place of prayer. Yet their presence created new unease. For if the monastery's stones had vanished, what of the relics, the manuscripts, the icons held within? The possibility that sacred artifacts had been spirited away by supernatural means was deeply troubling, for it hinted at theft not by human hands but by powers beyond comprehension. Some of the first investigators turned their attention to the villagers. They interviewed men, women, and children separately, pressing them to recount what they had heard or seen. The answers varied, but what struck the examiners most was the emptiness of their accounts. No sound of crumbling stone. No cries of alarm. No lights in the night, save for a handful of disputed claims about faint singing or distant torches. Again and again, the villagers insisted on the same chilling refrain: they had heard nothing. To the investigators, this was more disturbing than any wild tale. Silence implied a controlled act, a vanishing carried out with precision so absolute that not even the air had been disturbed. Not all were convinced by talk of the supernatural. Some of the secular officials suspected fraud. Perhaps the monks themselves had abandoned the monastery, dismantling it stone by stone, smuggling relics and treasures away under cover of darkness. But this theory faced insurmountable obstacles. The labor required would have taken months, not hours, and would have left behind a mountain of rubble. Furthermore, where would dozens of monks vanish to without a trace? No sightings of roving brothers or hidden wagons were ever reported in the surrounding regions. The investigative notes preserved from that time paint a portrait of men struggling against their own disbelief. One official's record describes pacing the hilltop at twilight, staring at the flat grass, convinced that if he stared long enough he would catch the outline of hidden foundations or buried walls. Another account describes attempts to summon the memory of the monastery through sketches made by villagers, each producing similar outlines, towers, arches, and stone halls that had clearly existed. Yet nothing in the soil supported those images. It was as though a hand had wiped the place clean, erasing centuries of work in a single gesture. In frustration, some investigators turned to stranger ideas. One spoke of magnetic disturbances, claiming the earth itself had shifted and drawn the stones deep underground, though no instruments supported this. Another hinted at divine intervention, suggesting the monastery had been lifted as a sign of judgment. Such statements were hushed quickly, for they threatened to stir theological panic. Still, They revealed the desperation of minds trying to fit the inexplicable into frameworks of science or faith. The most curious detail to emerge from these early inquiries was the condition of the vegetation. Botanists noted that the grass where the monastery had stood was flattened in swirling, concentric patterns, reminiscent of immense weight or pressure. Some likened it to the marks left after storms or whirlwinds, yet no storm had touched the valley that night. The odd geometry of the flattened grass suggested deliberate force, though no one could say what kind. For the villagers, these strange imprints became proof that something unnatural had occurred. For the investigators, they were a puzzle too irregular to classify. As the weeks passed, the site became a magnet for speculation. More officials arrived, followed by travelers, journalists, and curious onlookers. Each left with more questions than answers. The first investigators, despite their diligence, could only conclude what they did not find: no rubble, no fire, no sinkhole, no theft. Their reports, filed with the county and the church, read less like conclusions and more like admissions of defeat. In trying to pin down the disappearance, they had only deepened the shadows around it. The villagers, watching these learned men scratch their heads and argue, began to feel both validated and unsettled. If men of knowledge could not explain the loss, then perhaps it truly lay beyond explanation. Some saw this as proof of divine will, others as evidence of dark forces. Either way, the investigators left behind a legacy of unanswered questions. What lingers most from their work is not their failure but the eerie impression that the monastery had never been there at all. Their instruments found nothing, their hands touched nothing, their records contradicted the very earth beneath their feet. The first investigators had come seeking clarity but departed with a deeper mystery. In their struggle to explain, they revealed something more terrifying: the world is capable of erasing even the most immovable structures, leaving behind not ruins, but absence. And in that absence lies a silence that no investigation, however thorough, could break. As the months slipped by and the monastery's absence became an accepted reality, the true terror did not diminish, it escalated. What began as shock and confusion within the village slowly transformed into a suffocating fear that colored every hour of daily life. The people of the valley no longer spoke of the monastery with casual familiarity. They spoke of it in whispers, in fragments, with furtive glances to ensure no unseen presence lingered nearby. It was not just the vanishing that unsettled them, it was the atmosphere it left behind, the sense that the land itself had become haunted by something more intangible than ghosts. Children were the first to show the change. They no longer played near the hillside where the monastery had once stood. They avoided even the paths that wound near it, as though sensing something adults refused to acknowledge aloud. Parents told them stories to soothe their fears, insisting that the monastery had been taken to heaven, carried away by angels as a reward for centuries of devotion. But the children shook their heads, claiming they still heard faint chanting at night carried down from the empty hilltop, soft voices that rose and fell with the wind. When one boy swore he saw lanterns flickering in the darkness where no structure stood, his mother struck him across the face and demanded silence. The stories were spreading too quickly, and silence became the villagers' only defense. Adults were no less affected. Farmers who once worked their fields with confidence began returning home early, unwilling to be caught outside after dusk. The tavern emptied sooner each evening, and the village square grew quieter. Markets thinned, conversations dulled. Even weddings and funerals became restrained, as if the shadow of the vanished monastery hovered over every ritual. The disappearance seemed to have cut a wound in the communal psyche, draining vitality from the rhythms of village life. Religious faith, which should have been a source of comfort, instead fractured under the weight of unanswered questions. Some parishioners insisted the monastery had been a site of hidden sin, that God had torn it from the earth in righteous fury. Others clung to the belief that it had been chosen for ascension, proof that holiness had been rewarded. These conflicting interpretations only deepened the unease, driving wedges between families who once knelt side by side in the same pews. Priests struggled to maintain order, offering sermons filled with vague reassurances. Yet behind closed doors, even they admitted their prayers felt unanswered, their own faith shaken by the inexplicable loss. The escalation of fear took on subtler, more insidious forms as well. Neighbors began to mistrust one another, wondering if someone in the village had angered heaven or unleashed a curse. The most unfortunate were those who had last visited the monastery before its vanishing. These men and women found themselves eyed with suspicion, whispered about in corners, accused of bringing bad luck. One poor widow, who had taken bread to the monks only days before the incident, was shunned so thoroughly she left the valley altogether, vanishing like the building itself. Nighttime in the valley became unbearable for many. The silence, once peaceful, now pressed against their homes like a weight. People reported strange dreams, of corridors stretching into endless darkness, of bells tolling where no bells stood, of monks with blank faces chanting words that echoed long after waking. Dreams spread like infection, passed from one villager's confession to another, until it seemed everyone shared the same phantoms of sleep. Some took to leaving candles burning at their windows until morning, their flickering light a fragile shield against the unseen. Not all fear remained confined to the villagers. Travelers who passed through the valley also remarked on its oppressive air. Merchants spoke of the uncanny stillness, of livestock refusing to graze near the hill, of birds circling but never landing on the site where the monastery had once stood. A band of Romani, accustomed to legends and superstitions across Europe, refused to camp anywhere within sight of the hill, claiming it was cursed ground. Their refusal only deepened the villagers' dread, for if those accustomed to strangeness would not linger, what did that say of their home? The surrounding forests, too, seemed to change in the minds of those who lived there. Hunters reported losing their way along familiar paths, as though the land itself had shifted subtly. Strange animal cries were heard, unfamiliar, drawn-out wails that echoed against the cliffs. A shepherd swore that one morning, all his sheep had clustered tightly together, trembling violently, staring toward the vanished monastery as though at an unseen predator. When he tried to drive them onward, they resisted, bleating in unison until he gave up and turned back. The fear began to manifest physically. Illness spread, strange fevers, fatigue, an unshakable sense of heaviness. Doctors from nearby towns diagnosed stress, poor diets, or simple coincidence, but the villagers believed otherwise. They spoke of a sickness carried on the air around the monastery, a curse of absence seeping slowly into their bodies. Some swore their ailments worsened whenever they passed near the hill. Soon, many avoided the place entirely, giving it a wide berth as though it were contagious. Psychological decay took root most visibly in the young men of the village. Strong, confident youths who once laughed at ghost stories began to suffer nightmares and fits of paranoia. One, a farmer's son, was found standing at the hill's edge in the middle of the night, barefoot and muttering prayers to the empty sky. When pulled back by his father, he screamed that the monastery was calling him inside. Days later, he hanged himself in the barn, leaving behind a note with only 4 words, "I heard them sing." These incidents spread fear like wildfire. Each act of madness or despair seemed to confirm that something remained on the hill, invisible yet powerful, pulling at the minds of those who lived nearby. The investigators' reports had offered no solutions, and now the villagers were left to fend for themselves against a presence that could not be seen, touched, or named. The fear became cyclical, feeding itself, growing stronger with every whispered story, every sleepless night, every unexplained tragedy. As the atmosphere worsened, a subtle shift occurred. The villagers, once united in their dread, began to isolate themselves even from one another. Doors that once stood open were barred shut. Windows were covered. Families ceased visiting neighbors. The community that had once gathered for prayer, work, and celebration now retreated into silence, each household struggling alone against a creeping sense of doom. What was once a village began to resemble a scattering of fearful islands, each family cut adrift. By the end of that year, the monastery's absence was no longer spoken of in rational terms. It had become a living presence, an entity haunting the valley not by appearance but by omission. Its emptiness was louder than sound, heavier than stone. And in that silence, fear escalated into something beyond ordinary superstition. It became a truth, accepted yet never understood. The monastery had not merely disappeared. It had left behind a void, and that void was feeding on them. As fear tightened its grip on the valley, voices beyond its borders began to offer interpretations, each desperate to impose order on an event that seemed designed to defy it. The monastery's disappearance had reached the ears of academics, clerics, philosophers, and even foreign travelers, each bringing their own framework of understanding. The struggle for explanations was not merely intellectual, it was a battle to reclaim stability, to prove that the world still obeyed rules, whether divine or earthly. And yet, with every theory proposed, the mystery only grew heavier, as though the void at the hill's summit swallowed not only stone but reason itself. The Church, invested in preserving its authority, advanced the first official narrative. Bishops declared that the monastery's vanishing was an act of divine will, punishment for sins too great to be spoken aloud. Whispers suggested that the monks had strayed from their vows, that secret heresies had been practiced within the cloisters, or that pride had infected their hearts until God struck them down. Sermons across the region echoed this refrain, warning congregations that unrepentant sin could call down the same obliteration. Yet this explanation faltered under scrutiny. The villagers, who had known the monks personally, found little evidence of corruption. They remembered men who had lived in poverty, who prayed ceaselessly, who gave bread to the hungry. Were these the souls God would punish by erasing their very home? For many, the Church's attempt at explanation felt like an evasion, a convenient veil to hide the terrifying possibility that God had not been the hand behind the act at all. Scholars, less bound by dogma, tried to construct natural explanations. A professor from Budapest suggested the hill concealed a vast subterranean cavern, into which the monastery had collapsed silently, swallowed whole by geological forces. He argued that the flat grass and unbroken ground were signs of the earth sealing itself over the wound. To prove his theory, he sent students with drills and tools to investigate. They dug, they tapped, they measured. What they found confounded them further: the rock beneath was solid, continuous, unfractured. There was no cavity, no collapse, no geological explanation that could satisfy the hunger for rationality. The professor left humiliated, his report filled with contradictions, though privately he admitted the site felt unnaturally whole, as if untouched by the ordinary history of stone. Other scientific theories veered into stranger territory. Some whispered of lightning storms, of rare phenomena that could incinerate matter so completely it left nothing behind. Others speculated about magnetic disturbances, forces that might disintegrate stone or transport it elsewhere. A physician, familiar with tales of hysteria, suggested mass delusion, that the monastery had never existed at all, that villagers and investigators alike had fallen prey to shared fantasy. But when he was shown centuries of records, sketches, and relics tied to the monastery, even he faltered. How could an entire building, centuries of history, and generations of monks be dismissed as illusion? His theory was ridiculed, yet it lingered uncomfortably in the air, for it hinted at something darker, that human perception itself could not be trusted. Folklore offered explanations no less compelling. Storytellers in nearby villages claimed the monastery had been built on cursed land, sacred to pagan rites long before Christianity arrived. According to these tales, the monks had unknowingly erected their home over an ancient altar, and the earth had grown restless at the intrusion. The vanishing, they said, was the spirits reclaiming what had always been theirs. Some recited an older legend, of a monastery that had once disappeared in the mountains of Wallachia centuries earlier, under equally mysterious circumstances. Whether these accounts were history or invention mattered little, they spread quickly, feeding the sense that the Transylvanian monastery was not an isolated event but part of a darker pattern. The villagers themselves, desperate for clarity, clung to fragments of each theory, weaving them into stories that were half fear, half hope. Some argued the monks had been taken bodily into heaven, chosen for their purity, their absence a miracle rather than a curse. Others countered that what rose from the hilltop was not holy but infernal, that the monks had been dragged downward, monastery and all, into a realm of punishment beneath the earth. In taverns, people argued late into the night, voices cracking with desperation, each theory clashing like weapons, each leaving the same hollow truth: no one knew. The investigators' earlier reports were revisited, parsed for overlooked detail. The concentric patterns in the grass became the subject of endless debate. Were they evidence of weight, of descent, of some mechanical lifting of stone into the sky? Or were they merely natural swirls pressed by wind and imagination? Even the silence of the villagers' testimony was dissected. Was the absence of sound proof of divine intervention, or did it hint at forces unknown to science? Every scrap of information, once dismissed as trivial, was now clutched at like a relic. The struggle for explanation soon drew in outsiders less concerned with truth than with spectacle. Writers and pamphleteers capitalized on the story, spreading lurid accounts that mixed fact with invention. One widely circulated piece claimed the monastery had vanished in flames seen as far away as Cebu, though no villager confirmed this. Another insisted the monks had been practicing forbidden alchemy, their experiments finally consuming them. These tales traveled faster than sober reports, and the monastery's disappearance became a legend far larger than the valley itself. With every retelling, the truth receded further into obscurity, drowned beneath a tide of speculation. For the villagers, this struggle for explanations was both a curse and a strange comfort. Theories, however flawed, offered shape to the formless terror. Even as they quarreled over whether it was heaven or hell, nature or madness, at least they had words to lay against the silence. But that silence always returned. When the lanterns were extinguished, when families lay awake in the oppressive stillness of night, the theories dissolved, and only the fact remained: a building of stone had vanished without trace, leaving behind an emptiness no explanation could fill. The most unsettling attempts at explanation came not from priests or scholars but from those touched most deeply by the event, the villagers themselves, who had lived with its aftermath. Some began to insist that the monastery had not disappeared at all. Rather, it had shifted. It still stood, they claimed, but not in this world. At certain hours of dawn, they said, if one stood very still at the hilltop, a shadow of it could be seen in the corner of the eye, arches rising where grass now lay, a cross faintly outlined against the sky. These claims spread quietly, for to admit them aloud was to invite ridicule. Yet more than one villager confessed to glimpsing something at the edge of vision, a memory burned too strongly to ever fade. The battle between reason and belief intensified, leaving scars on the valley's soul. Each theory offered briefly the comfort of comprehension, only to collapse under its own weakness. No explanation stood firm. What remained was the gnawing sense that the world was not as stable as they had once believed, that structures of stone and faith could vanish without cause, leaving only questions that deepened like shadows at dusk. The struggle for explanations revealed less about the monastery itself and more about the fragility of human certainty. In the end, the monastery had taken not just its stones but the villagers' trust in the order of the universe. What was once a simple hill crowned by a sacred place had become a wound in reality, one that no sermon, no study, no story could ever close. When the monastery first disappeared, the human instinct to explain rushed in to fill the silence. In the days that followed, the villagers searched for meaning with frantic energy, as if by offering theories they could make the impossible bearable. Some turned immediately to faith, others to suspicion, and a few, mostly outsiders, tried to wield the language of reason. But the hill remained mute, and every explanation, however convincing at first, eventually collapsed under the weight of the evidence, or the lack of it. The church sent its representatives within a fortnight. A handful of priests, accompanied by scribes and attendants, came not only to comfort the shaken villagers but to record the event. They walked the bare slope, tracing wide circles, stooping low, touching the grass as though their hands could detect the residue of holiness. Some even pressed their ears to the ground, hoping for the rumble of a hidden chamber or the echo of voices trapped below. Their notes described the scene in careful Latin: no stone, no fracture, no imprint of human craft. The earth appears as though no monastery was ever here. To the villagers, their visit brought only more unease. Instead of answers, the priests carried away questions, wrapping the mystery in parchment and sealing it with wax. Their sermons framed the disappearance as an act of God, a divine mystery beyond mortal understanding. Perhaps the monastery had been lifted into heaven, or perhaps it had been taken as punishment. Either way, the priests counseled silence, urging the villagers not to probe further but to trust in the inscrutable will of the divine. For some, this explanation sufficed, a fragile balm for the wound of uncertainty. For others, it felt like an evasion, a cage made of faith. But not all agreed with the church's pronouncements. Among the villagers, a darker whisper spread: the devil had claimed it. Old men remembered tales of the hill being cursed ground long before the monastery's foundation. They spoke of pagan sacrifices, of restless spirits buried beneath, of omens ignored when the monks raised their walls. The vanishing, in this telling, was not a miracle but a reckoning. Mothers hushed their children with warnings: do not walk near the hill, for the ground is hungry. These stories spread quickly, like shadowy roots beneath the surface, because they offered an explanation that matched the fear in people's hearts. Then came the men of reason. A small group of scholars and surveyors, having heard rumors of the event, arrived from Cluj months later. With their compasses and measuring rods, they approached the mystery not with prayers but with tools. The most popular theory among them was geological, that a cavern had yawned open beneath the monastery and swallowed it whole. The Carpathian Mountains, they argued, were riddled with caves and limestone chambers, some large enough to collapse without warning. Perhaps the monastery had been built atop such a weakness, its fate sealed from the very beginning. On paper, the theory seemed solid. But on the hill itself, it crumbled. The scholars tapped the ground, drilled shallow holes, mapped the soil. It was firm, undisturbed. No sinkhole. No fissures. No collapsed terrain. The monastery, if it had truly sunk, should have left scars, torn earth, broken stones, splintered timbers. Instead, the hill looked untouched. The grass grew evenly, the soil was smooth, as if centuries had passed since anything heavy had stood there. The villagers watched the scholars argue among themselves, their confidence unraveling. Eventually, the men packed their tools and left, their notes filled not with solutions but with contradictions. In the absence of clarity, speculation turned wild. Some claimed the monastery had been dismantled in secret, its stones carried away under cover of night by agents of the church or by rival lords seeking to erase its presence. This theory gained traction among those who distrusted authority. But even the most cynical could not explain how such a task could have been accomplished. To remove an entire monastery overnight without a trace, without the sound of wagons or labor, without rubble scattered in haste, it was beyond the reach of human secrecy. Others proposed stranger ideas. A handful of villagers, particularly the young, whispered of time itself breaking. They said the monastery had slipped into another century, a casualty of some cosmic error. Perhaps it still existed, but in the wrong age. Some claimed to hear bells tolling faintly at dawn, as if from another time. These rumors unsettled even the practical, for they offered no comfort, only the possibility that the monastery was still there, unseen, forever out of reach. And then there were the folkloric explanations, the kind that rooted themselves deeply in Transylvanian soil. Stories circulated that the monastery had not been built to serve the villagers at all, but to seal something beneath the hill. For generations, the monks had chanted to hold back what lay buried, to keep an ancient hunger asleep. When their faith weakened, the seal broke. The monastery did not vanish, it was consumed. Its stones, its bells, even its monks became food for what had been imprisoned. If true, then the whispers people claimed to hear on the wind were not the monks calling back, but the voices of what had been freed. Theories bloomed and withered, each leaving behind more unease than relief. The villagers found themselves caught between forces they could not name, divine, infernal, natural, or something else entirely. Each explanation said more about the hearts of the believers than about the monastery itself. The faithful clung to miracles. The fearful whispered of curses. The curious pointed to geology, time, or hidden politics. But all failed in the same way, they could not explain the silence. How could stone vanish without sound? How could grass grow evenly where rubble should lie? The silence of the hill defied every answer. In the end, the attempts to explain became part of the mystery itself. Theories were told in taverns, written in journals, muttered in confessions, yet none satisfied. The hill remained mute, its silence louder than words, mocking every effort to tame it with reason or faith. And so, as the years passed, the villagers carried their explanations like fragile charms, choosing whichever one frightened them least. But the truth, if truth there was, lay beyond their reach, hidden in the silence of the vanished monastery. The night before the monastery disappeared, the village was still. Winter was loosening its grip on Transylvania, and the valley was wrapped in a faint mist. The monks had completed their vespers, their candles flickering in the narrow windows of stone. A few villagers, walking home from late chores, saw the warm glow of light across the hill, and they went to bed comforted, secure in the rhythm that had never faltered. The monastery had always been there. The bells had always rung. No one expected that dawn would bring silence. When the first rays of the sun cut across the valley, they struck the hilltop as they had for centuries, but instead of gilding towers and walls, they revealed an emptiness. The monastery was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, not toppled into ruin. Simply gone. The grass shimmered wet with dew as though untouched, as if no stone had ever pressed its weight into the earth. Paths that had wound up the hill ended suddenly in open ground. There were no walls, no rubble, not even shards of broken glass from the windows. The monastery had not collapsed, it had been erased. The first to notice were the shepherds. From their pastures they looked up, expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the spire against the pale sky. Instead they saw only the curve of the hill, clean and bare. At first, they thought the mist concealed it, but as the sun strengthened, their unease grew. By mid-morning, word spread like fire. Families abandoned breakfast, doors were left swinging open, and the entire village climbed the slope together, driven by disbelief more than curiosity. The higher they climbed, the heavier the silence became. When they reached the top, they stopped. The grass stretched unbroken where cloisters and courtyards should have stood. Even the ground bore no scars. It was as though the monastery had never existed at all. Confusion quickly turned to panic. People dropped to their knees, clawing at the soil with bare hands, searching for stone beneath the surface. They tore at the grass, expecting to find hidden foundations. There was nothing. A few broke down, weeping openly, while others shouted at the sky, demanding answers from a god who had stolen their sanctuary. Some of the older villagers made the sign of the cross again and again, as though warding off evil. But no gesture, no word, could alter the sight before them, a monastery erased so completely that even memory felt fragile. The church bell in the village rang that day not to summon worship but to hold despair at bay. The priest, pale and shaken, tried to calm the crowd. He spoke of miracles, of mysteries that could not be understood, urging them to find strength in faith. Yet his voice cracked, and those who watched him saw fear in his eyes. The idea that a monastery, a holy dwelling, a house of prayer, could simply vanish was too great a burden for reason to carry. Faith itself trembled under the weight of it. As evening fell, the villagers gathered again at the foot of the hill, unwilling to return to their homes. Torches flickered in the gathering dark as families huddled together, staring at the silent slope. Some claimed they heard faint echoes drifting from above, a bell tolling where no bell stood, voices murmuring in a language too distant to understand. Others dismissed it as imagination, the mind conjuring sound to fill the unbearable silence. But the longer they listened, the more convinced they became that something lingered. The monastery had not simply disappeared, it had slipped into some unseen place, its inhabitants calling across a gulf that could not be bridged. That night, the valley was restless. Dogs howled without reason. Horses stamped and strained in their stalls. Mothers kept their children close, while men sat awake, staring into the fire. The absence of the monastery was more than a loss of stone and mortar. It was a wound in the fabric of their world, a reminder that permanence was an illusion. They had lived their entire lives under the shadow of the monastery, and now the shadow itself was gone. The following morning, the sun rose again on the empty hill. The villagers climbed once more, hoping perhaps that the monastery would return, that the silence had only been a dream. But the hill remained bare, its grass swaying in the wind. A terrible finality settled over them. Something had happened that defied their senses, their prayers, their explanations. The monastery, with its monks, its bells, its sacred halls, had reached its vanishing point. And in its place, there was only silence. In the weeks that followed the monastery's disappearance, life in the village staggered on, but nothing truly returned to normal. The market reopened, the church bells rang, and families tried to busy themselves with chores, yet an invisible weight hung over everything. The fields were tilled and the animals tended, but people no longer sang at their work. Laughter, once carried on the evening air, had become rare, brittle, and when it did surface, it often ended abruptly, as though the memory of the vanished monastery had intruded upon joy. It was not simply the loss of a building that haunted them, it was the awareness that such a loss could occur at all. The hill where the monastery had stood became a forbidden place. At first, children dared each other to climb it, to see whether any stones remained, to listen for voices in the grass. Some claimed they did hear faint murmurs, like chanting rising from the soil, while others returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they had felt. Soon, even the bravest avoided it. Parents scolded, elders warned, and gradually the hill returned to silence, unvisited except by the wind. Travelers who passed through the region and asked about it were met with carefully chosen words, or else averted eyes. The villagers seemed to conspire in secrecy, not through deliberate lies, but through a kind of shared fear that speaking too much might invite the monastery back, or worse, invite whatever had taken it. The church's response was muted. A priest was dispatched from a nearby town, tasked with restoring order and calming the faithful. He offered sermons that urged acceptance, framing the monastery's disappearance as a divine mystery, a test of faith. But the villagers noticed how his hands trembled when he spoke, how his eyes flicked toward the hill as though he too feared what it might conceal. The sermons did not reassure so much as remind the people that even the church had no true answer. In private, the priest was said to have written to his superiors, describing the hill as a place untouched yet cursed, urging them to avoid drawing too much attention to it. If pilgrims or the curious arrived, they were politely discouraged, guided to other shrines and churches. Slowly, the story was pressed down, as though by official design, into silence. Yet silence cannot smother memory. The villagers carried the monastery in their hearts, retelling its story not in public squares but in kitchens, by hearths, in whispered exchanges during long winters. These stories shifted with each retelling. In one version, the monks had been holy men lifted bodily into heaven. In another, they had practiced forbidden rites and been dragged into the earth by demons. Some claimed the monastery had not vanished at all but had slipped into another century, that one day it might return, its bells tolling again at dawn. What united all the stories was the unease beneath them, the knowledge that none of them truly satisfied, none could explain the impossible quiet of that morning in 1895. As decades passed, the memory became a kind of folk inheritance. Parents told their children not to wander near the hill, not to linger after dark, not to question too deeply. A hush fell whenever the subject arose in public. Outsiders sometimes heard fragments, stories told in the tavern when drink loosened tongues, but they never heard the full tale. It was as if the villagers believed the monastery was listening, waiting for its name to be spoken too boldly. To this day, locals describe a heaviness in the air near the site, as though the ground itself remembers, refusing to yield its secret. For those who lived through it, the aftermath was not only the loss of a sacred place but also the corrosion of certainty. If stone and faith could dissolve overnight without explanation, what else could be trusted? The monastery had anchored them, a constant presence in their landscape and their prayers. Its vanishing left not only a gap in the earth but in their sense of reality. Life continued, harvests came and went, marriages and funerals were held, generations were born, but beneath it all lay a fragile awareness: stability was an illusion. At any moment, the ground could betray, the familiar could vanish, and silence could speak louder than bells. The aftermath, then, was not a single event but a lingering condition. It stretched into years, shaping the rhythm of the village, shaping the way people told their history and imagined their future. Some tried to forget. Others clung to memory. But none escaped the silence. The monastery had left behind no rubble, no relics, no proof of existence. And yet, in its absence, it had become more present than ever. It lived in dreams, in whispers, in the hush of twilight when the villagers avoided the hill. The monastery that vanished at dawn continued to exist, not in stone or mortar, but in silence, a silence that endured long after the last witness was gone. As years slipped into decades, the monastery's disappearance became less a fresh wound and more an inherited scar. Yet the absence refused to fade, and where explanation was denied, theories rose like weeds, each one more elaborate than the last. The villagers, the church, and curious outsiders all wrestled with the same void, each trying to clothe it in meaning, to tame it with words. But the more they theorized, the stranger the story became. Among the villagers, the earliest explanations were religious. Many believed that God himself had removed the monastery, not through violence, but through erasure, as though drawing a finger across the page of history. The monks, it was whispered, had grown proud, turning their prayers into spectacle, their fasting into vanity. If holiness was compromised, perhaps heaven had intervened, not with fire and brimstone but with silence. The monastery was not destroyed, they said, but lifted away, carried into the sky like Elijah of old. To those who clung to faith, this was both terrifying and comforting, a reminder of God's power, but also a sign that divine justice could strike without warning, even upon the most sacred ground. Yet there were others whose whispers turned darker. They believed the devil had claimed it. Old stories told that the hill had once been a burial site, a place of restless spirits long before the monastery's foundation was laid. The monks, in their zeal, had built atop cursed earth, thinking their chants and bells would sanctify it. But curses are patient, older than prayers, and when their time came due, the monastery was swallowed whole. According to this theory, the voices the villagers now heard were not monks calling across dimensions, but souls condemned, howling from a pit below the earth. Mothers warned their children, listen too closely to those whispers, and you will join the monks beneath the hill. When outsiders arrived, their explanations carried the tone of reason, but not the comfort of it. A handful of geologists suggested a sinkhole had formed under the monastery, dropping the entire structure into the depths. On paper, the idea seemed plausible. The Carpathians were riddled with caverns, some vast enough to swallow churches. But the hill was examined, tapped, measured. No cracks, no hollow spaces, no disturbed soil. The ground was firm, undisturbed, as though it had never borne the weight of stone at all. To accept the sinkhole theory, one had to believe in a collapse so complete that it erased every trace, every fragment, leaving nothing but grass. Few who saw the sight could bring themselves to believe it. Others leaned into conspiracy. They claimed the monastery had been dismantled in secret, pulled down by order of the church itself. There were rumors of hidden manuscripts, heretical writings, or forbidden practices concealed within its walls. If the monastery had harbored dangerous truths, perhaps the church silenced it in the most literal sense. Yet even this explanation fell apart under scrutiny. To dismantle stone towers and cloisters overnight, without sound, without wagons, without rubble, such a feat was beyond the reach of secrecy. And why leave an inexplicable void behind? Why not replace the monastery with ruins, a story of fire or plague? Silence, in this case, seemed the least convenient of fictions. More fantastical theories spread as the decades wore on. Some suggested the monastery had slipped between worlds, not destroyed but displaced, existing still in some other dimension. This was supported, at least in imagination, by the whispers, voices that sounded near yet unreachable, like prayers traveling through glass. If the monks had been pulled sideways into another plane of existence, perhaps they were calling back, begging for rescue. Others inverted the theory, claiming the monastery had never been real at all, but a projection, a mirage of stone and voice borrowed from another reality. When its time was up, it dissolved, leaving the villagers to wonder if they had ever truly seen it at all. Folklore lent its own interpretations. In older Transylvanian tales, monasteries and churches were sometimes built not only to worship but to guard. Some whispered that the vanished monastery was never meant to serve the people, but to seal something beneath the hill, an ancient hunger, a force that demanded silence. For centuries, the monks had held it in check with prayer and ritual. But when their vigil weakened, the seal broke. The monastery did not vanish, it was consumed, its stones devoured as the prison crumbled. The whispers, then, were not the monks at all, but the freed voices of what they had bound. Theories, of course, said as much about the believers as about the monastery. The faithful spoke of judgment. The fearful spoke of curses. The curious spoke of rifts in time and space. The skeptical whispered of politics and secrecy. Each theory shaped the story differently, but none could close the wound, for all of them failed to explain the most unsettling detail, the silence. How could such an erasure occur without sound, without collapse, without even a sigh from the earth? Theories wrapped themselves around the void like vines around stone, but the void remained, untouchable, mocking every explanation. In the end, the villagers did what humans have always done. They chose the theory that frightened them least, or the one that gave them the illusion of control, and carried it with them like a shield. Some spoke of divine will. Others muttered of demons. A few insisted it was all an illusion, that the monastery had never been real. But beneath their words, beneath the debates of scholars and priests, there lay a quieter truth: no one knew. No one would ever know. And in that unknowing, the mystery thrived, its silence louder than any explanation. Theories of the vanished monastery filled journals, sermons, tavern tales, and secret conversations by firelight. But none, not even the most convincing, could erase the unease that the villagers carried. Theories were fragile things. The silence of the hill was not. It remained, vast and impenetrable, a monument not to what was explained, but to what had been taken.